We've made a visualization that's probably good enough for the purposes of quality assurance by the person who collected the data. But ultimately, if we're going to make this into a data product, it would be nice if other scientists can make sense of the graph, and we can make that a lot easier for them. First of all, let's take a look at this x-axis and think about ways to make it clearer what's going on with the data on the x-axis. First of all, it might be nice to put ticks on every day so it's clear that there's 1 day of data per tick, and then we can adjust the labels accordingly. If we go back to our code, currently we are taking whatever the default settings are for our x-axis by calling the axis.posixct function, specifically for creating an axis with POSIX-CT data types, and putting it on side 1, which is the x-axis, 2 being the y-axis, 3 being the top, and 4 being the right. So we can add some arguments to this call to axis POSIX-CT to create more ticks and hopefully clean up that axis a little bit. First of all, I know I'm going to be adding a lot of long arguments here, so I'm going to go ahead and break this line of code up. And then I'm going to, first of all, use the argument at. The argument at lets you specifically tell it where you want the ticks to be at. So in this case, we're going to want to define specifically where we want ticks. And I'm going to put in a variable here that I call xticks. And that means we need to define what we want, where we want the ticks to be by defining the variable xticks. And I'm going to do that using the seek function and a special version of the seek function called seek POSIX t, sorry. So this is for creating sequences of the POSIX data type. Just like doing sequences of numbers, I need a from and a to. And I've already defined my from, that's the start of my week, and my to is the end of the week. I've already had those dates defined up higher in the code for this particular loop, iteration of the loop, week start and week end. And then finally, I need to tell it how frequently. Now, this version of Seek, the POSIX-XT, or the POSIX-T version of Seek, has the ability to understand different units of time for the by. So we want a tick every day, we can specify the by as day. Now we have X ticks defined and we can put ticks on every day. Let's go ahead and see how this works. I'm going to go ahead, it looks like I haven't run this yet, so I'm going to go ahead and run the whole thing by running my processing script. And now I can go to my plot, refresh it, and we can see we now have a tick on every day. And because the labels will fit, we have a label on every day, March 3rd, March 4th, March 5th. Now, ultimately, it would be nice to know what year this is March is for on a quick glance. This is especially useful if you have data going across multiple years. It'd be useful to have. So let's go ahead and figure out how to change the format of our ticks. Now, there is an argument to the axis POSIX-T or POSIX-CT function called format. And this uses the same format as we used for as POSIX-CT. I'm sorry, for as POSIX-CT in order to define the specific date time format. The format I prefer is a %E, that's the day of the month without the leading zero if it's a single digit. %B is the 3-day abbreviation of the month with letters. I find that more readable than a number. And %Y for giving us the 4-digit year. So I'm going to hit Control-Shift-Enter to rerun this chunk, which should regenerate the graph. And now we can see we have the day, the month, and the year on our tick labels. Now this is great, but we can see, well, we don't have a label on every tick anymore, and that's because the automatic formatter for the axis can recognize that ultimately these text boxes are going to overlap if it tries to put a label on every tick. And well, that's a problem. And so it just does it every other day. Well, I would like on this graph to be able to immediately see a date underneath each day of data that's in this graph. So what I'd really like to do is put the month, day, or the day, month, and the year underneath that given day of data. Now, if I had the time on here, the 000 time on here, then I might want to leave it under this tick because that is midnight on the morning of the 3rd of March of 2021. But I'm not going to put time on these because what I really care about is having the day's worth of data associated with the date. So I would rather have the date moved over a little bit and be directly under the day. And if possible, I'd like to see the date directly under the data corresponding to that date. Now, I'm not going to be able to make that fit if the month, day, and year are put in here horizontally, but if I rotate them to make them vertical, then they're going to fit. So let's talk about how we could do that. We can take control over the labels of the ticks directly by saying, well, let's not have AsPosic CT figure out where to put these labels. In fact, we're just going to turn off labels entirely by using the labels argument to say labels equals false. I could also use labels to put specific labels in here, but unfortunately there's no way with AsPosic CT to rotate the text. We have to use another function to do that. We have to add the text with another function. So we still want to put ticks on side 1. We still want to have ticks on every day, but we don't want labels. And if I rerun this with the labels off, hit R to refresh, now we don't have any labels on the ticks, but we still have a tick on every day. Okay, so now how do we get our ticks located, rotated? Well, first of all, we can use the text function to add text to the graph directly, but we're going to give we're going to give coordinates for the text and where it goes with X and Y coordinates. And this is one of those cases where I need to have data defining the x-axis for defining the x-axis, but I would prefer if I had a relative scale for the y-axis because I don't want to have to think about the scale of par in order for placing text. So this is one of those cases where I perhaps want to add a plot.window statement to rescale my axes, and I want my xlim to still be starting from the beginning of the week to the end of the week. So I'm not changing that. I still want to use data to define the scale for my x-axis in terms of times. But for my y-axis, I'd rather use a relative scale. So I'm just going to adjust this between 0 and 1. And that just makes it so I don't have to think about the par units in order for placing something on the y-axis. Okay, back to my text. Now I can say, well, I need my labels to be at the location of each tick, and that means I want my x-axis to be at my x-ticks locations. So I've defined x-ticks as starting from week start to week end by day. So this should give me a label on every tick. For my y-axis locations, I can locate these tick labels relative to the 0 to 1 scale for my y-axis. And I know there's a buffer there. So what I'm going to need to do is repeat values for y, because I need as many values for y as I have values for x. And I want to think about where to put things relative to this 0, 1 scale for the axis. And I know that the very edge of the y-axis is going to be at 0.04 because of that 4% buffering by default. And then I need to go a little farther than that because I need to get the labels past the ticks. If I put them right on the axis, then they're going to be colliding with the axis. So maybe I want to put this somewhere like minus 0.08 to make sure it's a little bit off of the scale. And then I need to repeat this as many values as there are at x ticks. So I can use the length of x ticks to make sure that I have minus 0.8 vector as long as these as long as this x ticks vector. Now that I'm putting these just below the ticks, and I want to make sure that the ticks are justified correctly so that they don't overlap with the ticks. As a matter of fact, let's just go ahead and see what this looks like so far. I'm going to rerun this. Oops, I have got a bug somewhere. Ah, I see the problem. I've accidentally put week start twice here, so I only have one tick through the whole week. What I really need is a week start through the week end for my xlim. So let's try that again. Oh, and now we've got all of our data plotted. That means I've forgotten that if I reset the scale before I make the ticks, I'm actually calling my plots, my points functions right after that. And I don't want the axes scaled relatively for those. I need them scaled by par. So I've forgotten that I also need to call plot.window again here. And my xlim should be week start to week end. And my ylim in this case should be the ymin and ymax that I defined it based on par earlier on. So one more time. That fixed it. So now I've got my scaling set back correctly. I've got ticks in every day. However, we're not seeing the labels, and it's because I've forgotten one more thing, and that's that XPD argument. So when you call text, text is designed for putting text within the plotting area, which means if you put text somewhere outside the plotting area, by default, it's going to get clipped or masked, so you won't be able to see it. So I need to make sure I have this XPD equals true argument when I call text to make sure that if I put text outside the plotting area that we can see it. Again, I'm going to rerun this trunk. And, well, we've got the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's because we haven't added labels yet. So we need to say what the labels are for each of the ticks. And in this case, we want X ticks again, but X ticks, remember, is POSIX CT. So if we want them formatted the way we want, we need to use the format function, call it on X ticks. And here's where we're going back to wanting that %E space %B for the 3-digit or the 3-character abbreviation of the month, capital Y for the month of the year. So now we have labels that correspond with each one of our ticks. Let's look at this again. Okay, now we've got what we want. 3 March 2014, I believe. 4 March 2021, 4 March 2021, etc. But like I mentioned, we're no longer using a tool that figures out whether these are going to collide or not. It's just going to go ahead and put them and they're colliding and we can't read them. So this is where we get to the point where we're now using a tool that lets us rotate that text. So going back to our code, there's an argument in text. It's the SRT argument that lets us rotate the direction of the text. In this case, let's rotate it 90 degrees. We want to turn it 90 degrees. Let's see what that looks like. Now we've rotated at 90 degrees, so it's not colliding with each other, but it is colliding with the graph. And that's because we need to think about how the labels are aligned relative to the location, or how the labels are justified to the location that we're giving it. So again, go back to our code one more time. There's another argument that we can add. I'm going to add it up here after the definition of x and y. And that's the ADJ argument. And it wants a vector with two values, and these are going to be the justification for the x and the y. Now on the x side of things, this is going to be the rotated text, so I want it to be right justified. And that's what's going to justify it to the top at 1. So 0 is left justified and 1 is right justified, and this is before the text is rotated. Which means that after it's rotated, 1 is telling it to top justify. So it's or justify right, then rotate, which is the same thing as justifying to the top. That means the entire label should be below the coordinates where I want to put the label. Or the other direction, I want to center justify with a 0.5. And again, that's justification up and down originally, but after it's rotated, it's justification left and right. So I want it centered on the tick. So it's a little bit confusing because we're rotating the text, but we'll see how this works if I rerun this chunk. Now we can see that we've moved the text down. We've justified it to the right relative to the direction of the text, which means we're justified to the point where we're putting the label, which is right about here. It's minus 0.08 from the y-axis. And we're saying in the other direction, vertical relative to the text, we're centering it, and that's how it's centered on the tick. So this is looking okay, but it's pretty clear that we're running off the bottom of the screen, or the bottom of our canvas, and that means we need to adjust our margins. That's outside of the loop. We have defined our margins up here, so let's give ourselves about, let's say, 0.2 more inches in our margins. I can rerun that chunk. Now that gives us more space, more margins, so we can see the whole label. Now, as I mentioned, if I were putting the 00:00 for the time on this, then I could see wanting to put these on the tick. But ultimately, I would like to put them under the day that they correspond with if I'm not putting the time, because this is just a day, right? And it makes much more sense to me to have the label for the day underneath that day's worth of data as opposed to underneath midnight on the morning of that day. So how do I shift these over? Well, the fact that I'm making these manually also gives me the ability to put them wherever I want. So if we go back to the code, I can, before I call this text, I can define a variable that I'm going to call x ticks shift. And I'm going to say that is x ticks plus whatever 12 hours is in seconds. So if I take 12 times 3600, that's 43,200. So I can shift my ticks over by 12 hours. My original ticks over by 12 hours, x ticks shift, and I can put these labels at that location rather than at the x ticks. So I'm basically moving things over by 12 hours. If I rerun the chunk, now you can see I've moved 3 March 2021 to be below, so it should be right below 12 noon in this case. So we see we have this extra label at the end here because we're plotting 8 days, and this is the label that would have been on this tick, and really there's no data from this day on the graph. So we kind of want to get rid of this last tick. If we go back to the code, what we can do is before we make these labels, we're going to just change xticks to get rid of the last index. And we can do that by using a minus sign for the index. So length of xticks is going to be the last index of xticks. And we're going to put a minus sign in front of it to say that we want to take the last element off of xticks and put that back into xticks. So this should get rid of that last element, and then we can present our labels based on this new xticks without that last element. If I rerun this code, now we can see we've gotten rid of that last label.